So my first claim is that we as an industry are the single industry in the world that understands ourselves and what it is that we're doing least. We are utterly confused about what our purpose is and what it is that we're actually building. And this name that we have, Multichain, is the perfect example of that. We call ourselves the blockchain industry, as if what we're producing, what we're meant to produce, are blockchains, right? What does the world want? What do people want? They want more blockchains. So we're going to produce more and more blockchains. Now, if you think about that for more than a second, it's a pretty absurd thought. Nobody wants a blockchain. A blockchain is like the slowest, worst kind of database we've ever invented. Right? The whole point is to get rid of blockchains, to try and use blockchains as little as possible. The only reason we use them is because they provide us with a degree of censorship resistance, right? So the idea that we would call ourselves after the thing that is least attractive about our industry is just a perfect example of how little we understand what we're doing. So what are we actually doing? We actually do produce something extremely exciting and extremely valuable. That's why we went from 0 to, something $3 trillion in sort of asset value created in just 16 years, the fastest growing economy in history, period. But what we're generating, what we are, is we're the ownership industry. Our goal and what we produce and the value that we generate that everyone in this room and everyone outside this room wants is the ability to actually own something. Not that you have to ask the bank for the ownership, or you have to ask the government for the ownership, or you have to ask your mom or your trust fund for the ownership. You get to actually own something. And that is extremely valuable. Okay, so why did we get so confused? Why is it that we don't call ourselves something exciting and interesting to normal people like the ownership industry, and instead we call ourselves something boring and wrong like the blockchain industry? And the answer is that we have sort of started from a central mistake. And the central mistake goes all the way back to the very, 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 very first version of Bitcoin. Bitcoin version 0.1.0. What a lot of people don't know is that in Bitcoin 0.1.0, there was not only the world's first digital crypto asset, there was also the world's first dApp. So Satoshi integrated into Bitcoin the ability to play a decentralized version of poker. He called it Poker Lobby. And by Bitcoin version 0.1.1, he had removed it entirely. The reason he removed it is because Satoshi looked at what he was creating and thought to himself, okay, I'm building this system which is going to be decentralized and distributed on the worst piece of technology I could possibly imagine, the absolute worst database I could imagine, a blockchain. And for me to try and pour into that additional things like complex program execution, like a dApp, is insane, and so I'm not going to do that. I'm going to pull it out, and I'm going to leave Bitcoin as a pure play ledger. And that was the decision he made. But as a result, Bitcoin has since then always been extremely limited. And so, for 13 years now, we've had an entire industry which has bifurcated into two parts. We've got Bitcoin, right, which is a pure play ledger with a very, very specific asset that ledger is good for, BTC. That's where the vast majority of the value has been created. And then we have another part of the industry where very, very valuable things have been created as well, but also a lot of scams and nonsense, which in part come out of the fact that this part sort of was not operating from first principles. It was doing very, very exciting stuff, but not operating from first principles. And what I mean specifically by that is, why did we start creating so many chains, right? So ultimately, we've been through this process now of 13 years where people looked at Bitcoin and they said, okay, that's really cool. And they looked at it and they thought it was really cool for different reasons, because it gives me true ownership. That's cool. Other people came and say, well, it's true cypherpunk. That's cool. And then a lot of people came to it and said, wow, somebody made money and its price is going up. I want to do that too. And so what they said is, okay, well, what can Bitcoin not do? Bitcoin can't do privacy, so we'll create a chain for that. Let's call it Monero or Zcash. Bitcoin can't do scale, so we will create a chain for that. Let's call it, I don't know, Ripple. Bitcoin can't do smart contracts, okay, so we'll create a chain for that. We'll call that, I don't know, like Ethereum or Avalanche. And so we've gone and produced chain after chain after chain, because where do you put the tokens? And what I really want is to sell you tokens, but I need to put them somewhere, and for that I need a chain, and I need another big word in our industry, narrative. There are only two industries in the world which talk about narrative as much as we do, right? It's us and Hollywood, right? Us and the marketing world, right? Industries that are creating, that understand what they're creating and creating things of substance do not spend this much time talking about how they're going to wrap it up in a story. But we do. And I think it's not because we're not creating value, it's because we don't understand what the value we're creating is. And it all comes down to the fact that this initial idea, this extremely powerful idea of you get to be an owner, and you can be anyone from, someone struggling to stay afloat in Zimbabwe, trying to deal with inflation, all the way to a regular person here in Bangkok, all the way to the government of the United States of America, all of you. You get ownership, and you get ownership, and you get ownership. Everybody gets ownership, and it scales, right? So we've got this really, really simple idea, and now we've built a lot of stuff on top of it with a lot of narratives that we needed to sell. So the question is, now we're at this magnificent moment in the history of our industry, right? Our industry for the last 16 years, in addition to having that challenge, had another big challenge, which was that the largest other economy in the world, the economy of the United States of America, as well as its government, has been sanctioning us, right? Who does the United States sanction? They sanction North Korea, they sanction Russia, they sanction Iran, and they sanction crypto. So we've built this entire industry while we've been under the world's worst sanctions, except for maybe, North Korea. And suddenly, we realize that the sanctions are going away. So we have this momentous moment where we can start building without the shackles of the sanctions, and we can start building something really important and true, something which will look like the future of ownership for everyone. And to do that, and the reason I'm on stage in part today, is because I think that if we're going to do that, we need to do it with a clear understanding of what the value we're creating is. So I'm going to suggest today a new language for us. The first word I would like us to get rid of is blockchain, or chain. It's a stupid word. Nobody wants it. It's confusing. You can't explain it to normies because they're right. They don't know what you're talking about because neither do you. Chains are not important. In fact, they stand in our way. I'll talk about the technology about why they stand in our way in a moment, but I want to replace that with a different word, a word that goes back to the ownership economy, and that word is ledger. What we're building are not chains, we're building assets, and those assets need to exist on a ledger, right? Another word I'd like to get rid of, interoperability. Right? Bridging. These are stupid words. Have you ever gone to the internet to use an interoperability bridging service so that you can go from one website to another? No, because that's ridiculous. Let's talk about a different word, a word that actually makes sense. Networks and network effects, right? So we've got assets and ownership that people want to create. And now we can create them and register them on a ledger. And where is the network effect? The network effect is in the ledger, right? Why? Because when I want to transact between two different assets and I need to be able to settle those transactions, what I really, really, really want is not to bridge between two different chains. What I really want is that that single ledger will record the change in my ownership, right? I used to have dollars, and now I've got Bitcoin. I used to have Bitcoin, now I have a house. I used to have a house, now I got divorced, right? All in one chain. That's where the network effect is. The more assets you have in one particular ledger, the more attractive using that specific ledger becomes. And therefore, ledgers have natural network effects. And when things have a natural network effect, you tend to get few of them, not lots of them. Okay, so forgetting bridging and chains and interoperability and thinking about ledgers and thinking about network effects, which ledger is going to be the most important ledger going forward? Well, we already know what is the most important ledger today. It's Bitcoin. That is where all of the value is, in fact, in one specific asset. And we also know that governments, large institutions, and perhaps most importantly, Michael Saylor, right, is looking to pour more and more value and write more and more value onto that ledger. But that ledger, it's the cause of all of the original problems. It's so limited. We cannot just issue any asset we want. We cannot scale it. We cannot create programmable assets. We cannot have privacy. All of the things that we want to be able to do, right? All of those things which actually made sense. Scalability, privacy, smart contracts, roll-ups, all of that really important stuff that was built by us. Because we recognized, intuitively or not, that it was necessary. None of that stuff seems to be available on Bitcoin. And so Bitcoin has been unable to act as this global ledger, this global settlement system, this global center of network effect. And so the only effect that we've gotten of it is its center of gravity. It goes up, everything else goes up. It goes down, everything else goes down. What if all of that could change? What if Bitcoin could do all of those things? Then we would finally unleash the full power of Bitcoin's ledger. Bitcoin's ledger would become this extremely important and valuable thing to all of us, a credibly neutral ledger that we can all interact with, regardless of, what tribe or assets we happen to have. And we would be able to get rid of the bridges that currently are funding the government of North Korea, right? We'd be able to get rid of these systems that are constantly getting hacked, right? That are reducing the security and introducing complexity that is unnecessary to our ecosystem. This has been my dream for 10 years. I have been convinced, and I've had an extremely sort of non-consensus view on everything that we're doing. For 10 years, I've looked at this industry and thought to myself, we're going in the wrong direction. We're building blockchains when we should be building assets. We're talking about chains when we should be talking about ownership. We're building, bigger and bigger chains, right? When what we should be doing is figuring out how we remove as much as possible from the chains. I think about Solana, which is really a magnificent piece of engineering. Seriously, right? How magnificent is this piece of engineering? Now, some of you probably hold Sol here, right? And I get it. It's growing. It's fast. It's the best blockchain that we have out there, which is kind of like saying it's the best, basketball player in Japan. Or sometimes I say it's like we've taken this turd, which is blockchain, and these genius engineers at the Solana have managed to polish this piece of shit so well, that you can see your face in it, right? But it's still, right, optimizing for the wrong thing. So for 10 years, I've been trying to see, is there an alternative? And then about 4 years ago, we saw a major upgrade which went quietly in Bitcoin. It was the Taproot upgrade. And that introduced new cryptography into Bitcoin and opened up new avenues of research. And so a group of us started researching what is possible with Bitcoin with Taproot. And a whole bunch of interesting ideas came out, which eventually led us a year ago, around October last year, to realize that it is possible to actually build all of this programmability into Bitcoin natively. And all we needed to do was to figure out how we can verify ZK on Bitcoin. And so we started working on that. In April of this year, we published a paper called Bitsnark and Grail, in which we described how we were going to verify ZK proofs of Bitcoin. And then 3 months later at Bitcoin Nashville, for the first time ever, we managed to verify ZK on Bitcoin. Bitcoin mainnet. Block 853.626, we think changed everything. Or at least that was what we were thinking at the time. But we didn't know what reaction it would get from the world. And then the reaction came. The reaction astounded us. The amount of developers who started working on BitcoinOS, right, looking to utilize the OS that we were building into Bitcoin, went far beyond our wildest imaginations. First, it was just Bitcoin developers, people who were involved with ordinals and runes. That made sense. And they started working on how they can build truly programmable tokens on Bitcoin. Then the other thing that we sort of expected was that a whole bunch of roll-up projects, which claim to be Bitcoin roll-ups but can't actually roll up to Bitcoin, started looking to integrate. And then a whole bunch of much, much larger projects that have sort of gone down this path for 13 years of trying to compete with Bitcoin, started building or experimenting on building on BitcoinOS, effectively trying to see how they could dissolve the borders between themselves and Bitcoin, effectively turning Bitcoin into their ledger. So there's quite a lot of them, and they are of size that we never expected. And then a few weeks ago, the first of them sort of made a public announcement about it, and that went super viral, and that was Cardano. And the crazy thing is that I'm sort of not allowed to, talk for them, but there's a lot of them who are working on this. I can, from where I stand, see the entire structure of crypto starting to shift to look more like what I always thought it should look like, which is basically this. You have a single ledger. That ledger is merely there to record assets and provide settlement of trade changes to the ownership of those assets. And then on top of that, you need an entire ecosystem of asset management systems, what we call smart contracts, or what we call programmability, or what we call off-chain activity, or what we call roll-ups. All of that stuff, right, is effectively systems for managing those assets or external compute environments. So what you want to be able to do is to verify any form of computation in the world onto a single chain and settle it. And that is what we're doing with BitcoinOS. We're allowing people to run programmability transactions of complexity and scale of any arbitrary nature, right? It could be a rollup, it could be Cardano, it could be a single dApp. It could be an AI system, it could be a system for your mortgage, right? It could be the agreement by which your wife or ex-wife gets your house, right? It could be anything. All of that computation can get rolled up into a ZK proof. That ZK proof gets written to Bitcoin, where it is verified and executed. The asset that it generates is generated on the world's best ledger, on Bitcoin. Those assets move ultimately between owners on Bitcoin, and all of the compute happens off-chain. That is an extremely simple structure, which makes sense for a world building for a single canonical layer of ownership. And I think that's what our industry is building. And I'm super excited by the fact that we're now moving to the point that we get to build that together. And I think that we're very, very lucky that after 13 years of all of these different chains competing with each other, somehow we still ended up with a system which competes with no one, a system which threatens no one, and is credibly neutral, that all of these other systems, be they Solana or Avalanche or Cardano or Merlin or rollups or dApps, can all plug into. And then we don't have to talk about bridges or interoperability. We can just talk about a single shared network for everyone. Now, I recognize that what I'm saying looks very different and feels very different from the entire structure of our ecosystem, our technology, and our industry up until today. But I think this is what's going to happen. I'm not going to say the Bitcoin maxi thing, it's inevitable. I don't think anything's inevitable. I think things are path dependent. I think if we didn't get ZK for Bitcoin now, 2 years from now, we would see the US government, launching bonds on Ethereum. But somehow, maybe because history has a poetry of itself, everything is coming back to Bitcoin. We now actually do have the technology to build everything on Bitcoin at exactly the moment that Bitcoin is entering the limelight as the ledger, the settlement system, the number one place you can build assets that everyone, including the government that used to be sanctioning our entire industry, trusts. This is a truly momentous time for us, right? And we're going to see an opportunity now through the ability to just post simple ZK proofs to Bitcoin, to scale Bitcoin, to scale our entire industry, and to integrate our entire industry into a single system for global ownership that is controlled by you and nobody else. I think that was always the goal, and I think we're making it happen. Thank you.